What is it?
What are you doing? What are you doing?
I don't know what you're talking about. You need to get off this plane right now.
Imagine boarding a plane, sliding into the seat you've chosen, and preparing for a long journey. Now imagine being told, in front of everyone, that you don't belong there. Not because of your ticket, not because of an error, but because of who you are and what someone else assumes about you. That's exactly what happened to Ethan Cole, a man dressed sharply, calm and unshaken, as he settled into his first-class seat on a flight he knew well. What the other passengers didn't know, Ethan wasn't just another traveler. He was the CEO, the very owner of the airline they were flying. But one entitled passenger decided that seat should belong to her, and one flight attendant made the mistake of enforcing it. What followed was a chain of events that would humiliate one woman, end another's career, and prove a powerful truth dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. So here's the question: what really happened on that flight? And how can one man's silence speak louder than the arrogance of others? Stay with us. And before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the powerful lessons inside this story. Ethan Cole stepped into the wide-body cabin with the ease of someone who had done this countless times before. The aircraft lights shimmered against the polished floor, reflecting a quiet elegance that only first class could promise. His tailored charcoal suit fit him like a second skin. Not loud, not flashy, just deliberate like everything about the man. A slim leather briefcase hung effortlessly from his hand. The subtle glint of a silver watch peeked from beneath his cuff as he adjusted it, then smoothed the sleeve as though he had all the time in the world. He walked down the aisle slowly, not because he needed to, but because he chose to. His eyes moved over the cabin in measured detail. The curve of the walls, the hum of the ventilation, the crisp uniforms of the crew greeting passengers with mechanical smiles. He could almost hear the rhythm of the boarding announcements blending with the shuffle of luggage wheels on the jet bridge. Row 2, Seat 2A. His seat. It was a window seat, chosen carefully. He liked watching the sky peel open during takeoff, the city below shrinking into toy-sized streets and rivers of headlights. He placed his briefcase in the overhead, slid smoothly into the plush leather seat, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For a moment, he was not Ethan Cole, the billionaire founder, the majority owner, the man whose signature carried the weight of entire fleets. He was simply a traveler. To everyone else boarding this Horizon Vista Airways Dreamliner, he was just another passenger, another man with a seat number and a ticket. And yet, even in this anonymity, he knew the truth being unseen was a double-edged sword. He pulled a worn book from his briefcase, its leather spine creased from years of travel. Reading had always been his sanctuary, the one habit that kept him centered no matter what storms raged outside. He opened to the folded page and let his eyes slip into the comfort of words, trying to leave the world behind for the 5 hours that stretched between New York and Los Angeles. The hum of boarding filled the cabin as more passengers trickled in. Some moved with impatience, tossing bags overhead. Others shuffled cautiously, eyes darting for seat numbers. Ethan barely looked up. He had learned long ago to preserve his energy, to remain calm, especially when the world seemed eager to test him. And then he felt it, a change in air pressure, a sudden shift in energy, the way light dims before a storm. He glanced up just as she entered. Victoria Hale, mid-50s, platinum blonde bob cut at a sharp angle, a designer handbag clutched like armor. Her floral blouse tucked crisply into tailored beige slacks. She moved with the practiced ease of privilege, scanning the cabin with eyes that expected the world to bend. Her gaze landed on him. For a fraction of a second, her stride faltered. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Ethan noticed. He had spent a lifetime noticing. Her face flickered with something she didn't intend to reveal: confusion, discomfort, maybe even disbelief. Then, like a mask being reset, she composed herself, smoothed her expression, and carried on. She walked with purpose until she stood directly in front of him. Ethan closed his book gently and looked up, his expression unreadable. He waited, but Victoria didn't speak to him. Instead, she turned slightly, lowering her voice as she leaned toward a nearby flight attendant. Her lips curled into a polite smile, the kind of smile that could cut glass. "Excuse me," she murmured, casting a brief glance back at Ethan before shifting her focus to the young blonde woman in uniform. "I think there's been a mistake. The flight attendant, Rachel Moore," frowned softly. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "That man," Victoria whispered. Her tone dipped in velvet but sharpened with certainty, "is sitting in my seat." Ethan's jaw remained steady, but a muscle in his temple ticked once. He kept his breathing even, his book resting lightly on his lap. Rachel glanced toward him, tablet in hand, scrolling quickly through the manifest, her brow furrowed. There it was. Seat 2A Ethan Cole. Still, there was something in Victoria's voice, in the certainty with which she spoke, that made Rachel hesitate. She shifted her weight, squared her shoulders, and offered Victoria a reassuring nod before moving toward Ethan. "Sir," she said, her tone brisk, trying for authority, "I'm going to have to ask you to move." The cabin seemed to quiet around them, the way a stage hushes when the first note is struck. Ethan slowly looked up, meeting her eyes. His voice, when it came, was smooth and polite. "Excuse me." Rachel cleared her throat. "It seems there was an error with the reservation. This seat is actually assigned to another passenger." Silence stretched. Ethan's eyes sharpened slightly. He closed his book with deliberate patience, the soft thud of the cover louder than the drone of the engines. Behind him, he felt Victoria's eyes boring into him, waiting for compliance. "That's strange," he said finally. His tone was calm, almost curious. "My boarding pass says 2A. Are you certain there's a mistake?" Rachel's grip on the tablet tightened. She hesitated, then pressed on. "I believe you'd be more comfortable in a seat further back in first class." Those words, "more comfortable," hung in the air. Ethan had heard them before. The polite veil draped over something uglier. Behind him, Victoria was already setting her purse down, claiming victory without speaking. Ethan could have argued. He could have revealed himself, pulled rank, reminded everyone whose aircraft this truly was. But he didn't. Instead, a faint smile touched his lips. Not in defeat, not in anger, something quieter, steadier, a knowing smile. He rose slowly, adjusting the lapels of his suit with deliberate grace. Rachel seemed to relax, relief softening her posture, as though she had expected a confrontation and was grateful it never came. Victoria inched forward, eager to seize what she thought was hers. Ethan slipped his phone from his pocket, tapped quickly, and sent a message without a word. Then he turned to Rachel. "Where would you like me to sit?" She gestured toward seat 5C. Ethan nodded once, lifted his briefcase, and walked down the aisle, his steps measured, unhurried. He lowered himself into the seat, placed his book on the armrest, and let the quiet settle again. Beside him, a young man barely 25, with messy hair and restless energy, leaned closer. His eyes darted between Ethan and the scene that had just played out. That was something, the young man muttered under his breath. Ethan glanced at him, then offered a small smile. "Patience," he said softly. "You'll see." The engines roared faintly as boarding continued, but Ethan sat still, his calm intact, his silence more powerful than any protest could have been. Somewhere inside him, the familiar ache stirred an ache born of years of being underestimated, of being misjudged. But he had learned that patience was not weakness. It was power waiting for the right moment. And the right moment, he knew, was already on its way. Victoria Hale moved with the kind of confidence that was not born from kindness or humility, but from a lifetime of being told the world belonged to her. Her heels clicked softly against the carpet as she advanced down the aisle. The polished leather handbag clutched firmly in her hand like a badge of authority. Every gesture radiated control. Every glance suggested that she expected others to step aside. When she reached row 2, her eyes narrowed. She stopped just short of Ethan Cole, the man seated calmly in 2A, his book balanced in his hand as though nothing in the world could disturb his concentration. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. A flicker crossed her face, confusion at first, then irritation. She had not expected to see a black man sitting there, much less one so composed, so utterly unbothered by her presence. Victoria prided herself on reading people quickly. She thought she could measure worth in an instant. And in that instant, she decided Ethan did not belong in seat 2A. Something in her chest tightened, a reflex she had never learned to question. She leaned toward Rachel Moore, the young flight attendant stationed at the front. Rachel had just finished helping another passenger store a bag in the overhead compartment. Her posture was crisp, professional, but her eyes darted quickly, betraying her youth and inexperience. "Excuse me," Victoria murmured. Her voice softened to a polite whisper. "I think there's been a mistake." Rachel straightened, attentive. "I'm sorry, ma'am. What seems to be the issue?" "That gentleman," Victoria said, tilting her head almost imperceptibly toward Ethan, "is in my seat." Rachel's brows pinched together. She glanced down at the tablet in her hands, scrolling quickly. She found the entry within seconds. 2A, Ethan Cole. The name sat there in black and white. Still, Rachel hesitated. The certainty in Victoria's tone carried weight, the kind of weight that could rattle someone who wasn't sure of their footing. Rachel glanced again at Ethan, who had not moved, who did not even seem fazed by the conversation happening inches away. Victoria's eyes hardened. "You see," she added, lowering her voice further, "I fly this route often. It is always my seat. There must have been an oversight." Rachel swallowed. The tension between doing what the manifest showed and appeasing a passenger who exuded authority pressed down on her. For a moment, she told herself it might be easier to resolve things quietly. A small adjustment. One man moved. One woman appeased. No scene. No escalation. But beneath that thought lingered another, unspoken. The woman pressing her carried a certain privilege, the kind that could write complaints, the kind that management might listen to. Rachel squared her shoulders and walked toward Ethan. She stopped just beside his seat. "Sir," she began, her tone brisk, almost rehearsed, "I'm going to have to ask you to move." The hum of the aircraft seemed to pause. Ethan's eyes lifted slowly from his book, meeting hers. They were dark and steady, carrying neither anger nor surprise. just a depth that made her falter for a beat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth, courteous, but edged with quiet strength. Rachel cleared her throat. "It seems there was an error with the reservation. This seat is actually assigned to another passenger." A silence followed, stretching between them. Ethan let it hang, then closed his book with deliberate patience. He set it on the armrest, his fingertips lingering on the cover. Behind him, he could feel Victoria's anticipation, her certainty that she was about to be rewarded. "My boarding pass says 2A," Ethan replied evenly. "Are you sure there's a mistake?" Rachel's grip on the tablet tightened. She hesitated, then pressed on. "I believe you would be more comfortable in a seat toward the back of first class." Ethan let the words sink in. More comfortable. The phrase echoed in his mind. Bitterly familiar. It was the language of polite exclusion, the kind of phrase designed to cloak bias in civility. He had heard it at restaurants, at hotels, in boardrooms. Always an invitation to step aside, to give way, to disappear. Inside, a storm stirred. He could feel the old ache rising, the indignation that never fully healed. Yet he breathed through it. Years had taught him that reacting in anger gave away power, that true strength lay in patience. He glanced at Rachel again. She was young, nervous, acting out of instinct, not malice, though instinct itself was shaped by something larger, something systemic. He could see her jaw tightening as if she feared the consequences of defying Victoria more than the consequences of displacing him. Behind him, Victoria smiled faintly, already setting her handbag down, already envisioning herself reclined with champagne in hand. The seat, in her mind, belonged to her. Ethan could have ended it there. He could have pulled out his wallet, shown the black card that opened doors around the world, revealed his name, reminded everyone that not only did he belong in seat 2O, he owned the airline itself, but instead, he smiled softly. It was not a smile of defeat, nor of anger, but of something deeper, a knowing patience. He rose slowly, adjusting the lapels of his suit. Rachel's shoulders eased, relief flooding her expression as if she had narrowly avoided a confrontation. Victoria stepped closer, her triumph barely concealed. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. A few quick taps, a message sent, the details precise. Then he looked at Rachel. "Where would you like me to sit?" he asked. Rachel gestured toward 5C, a few rows back. Ethan nodded once, picked up his briefcase, and walked calmly down the aisle. Every step was measured, his dignity intact. He slid into 5C, placed his book beside him, and let the quiet return. The young man seated next to him, Daniel Brooks, had been watching the entire exchange. He was no more than 25, with restless energy in his eyes, the kind of energy that belonged to someone still figuring out how the world worked, but unwilling to accept injustice silently. "That was unreal," Daniel muttered, leaning slightly closer. "You just let her take your seat." Ethan turned his head, meeting the young man's eyes. There was no bitterness in his expression, no anger, only a calm steadiness. "Patience," he said quietly. "You'll see." Daniel blinked, taken aback. "Patience, man." She just. But Ethan had already reopened his book, his eyes sliding over the words as though the entire scene were nothing more than a passing distraction. His hand rested lightly on the page, steady, composed. Inside, though, his thoughts swirled. He felt the familiar tension coil in his chest, the tug-of-war between silence and assertion, A lifetime of similar moments paraded through his memory, times when he had been dismissed, displaced, underestimated. Each one left its scar. Yet each one had also sharpened his resolve. He reminded himself of the message he had just sent, of the wheels already turning in motion. He did not need to raise his voice. The truth had a way of surfacing, and when it did, it spoke louder than any outburst ever could. Victoria Hale settled smugly into 2A, her triumph as palpable as the scent of her perfume. She crossed her legs, smoothed her blouse, and exhaled contentedly, believing she had won. To her, Ethan was invisible again. Just another passenger moved aside. But Ethan Cole knew differently. The storm had only just begun, and he was ready to meet it, not with anger, but with the unshakable force of patience, principle, and power. Rachel Moore stood frozen for a moment after Ethan Cole had risen from his seat. She felt the weight of what she had just done, though she couldn't quite name it. Her training told her she had resolved a conflict quickly, a small mix-up, a smooth adjustment. That was what supervisors like to hear: no escalation, no raised voices, no scene. Yet something inside her chest nagged, whispering that she had crossed a line she shouldn't have. Victoria Hale, on the other hand, had no hesitation at all. She lowered herself into 2A as though she had been born to sit there, smoothing the fabric of her slacks, her mouth curling in quiet satisfaction. To her, the situation was resolved exactly as it should have been, the right order restored. Ethan walked with measured grace to his new seat in row 5. The calm in his steps hid the storm inside him. He lowered himself into the chair, placed his briefcase neatly under the seat in front of him, and opened his book again. His hand rested on the page, but his eyes were not reading. They were remembering. How many times had he lived this script? A hotel desk clerk doubting his reservation, a valet assuming he was there to park cars, not claim one, a banker questioning his signature on a contract worth millions. Each time it happened, the same thought tightened in his chest: how easily dignity could be stripped away when people refused to see him as he was. And yet, Ethan had learned over the years that silence could be sharper than outrage. Patience could carve a deeper mark than fury. He had power in reserve, power he did not need to brandish to prove. Daniel Brooks shifted in the seat beside him. The young man's expression was restless, his leg bouncing as though he carried Ethan's indignation for him. "I don't get it," Daniel muttered, keeping his voice low. "Why didn't you say something you had the ticket? It was your seat." Ethan turned slightly, his gaze steady. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be defended. It only needs to be revealed." Daniel frowned. "But she just pushed you out like you didn't matter, like you didn't belong." A small smile touched Ethan's lips. "She believes what she believes, but belief does not change reality. Watch. The truth will speak." Daniel studied him, puzzled by the certainty in Ethan's tone. He wanted to argue, but something about Ethan's calmness silenced him. It was as if the man beside him lived in a different rhythm, one untouchable by the noise around them. Meanwhile, Rachel Moore moved down the aisle, her tablet clutched tightly, her heart beating fast. She told herself she had done her job, but the whisper in her chest refused to quiet. She glanced once toward Ethan in 5C, saw the calm on his face, and felt a pang of unease. She couldn't shake the image of his dark eyes when he had asked if she was sure. She hadn't been sure. She had just chosen the easier path. At the front of the cabin, Victoria Hale adjusted her handbag, slipped off her shoes, and stretched out with the air of someone who believed the seat had always been hers. She called softly for water, her tone syrupy but commanding. When Rachel delivered it, Victoria smiled as though rewarding loyalty. "Thank you, dear," she said sweetly, glancing toward Ethan without needing to add the rest of the sentence. "Thank you for putting him in his place." Rachel's smile faltered, but she forced herself to remain professional. Ethan sat with his book open, but his thoughts elsewhere. He thought of his father, who had worked 2 jobs and saved every dime to make sure his children had opportunities. He thought of his mother, who used to whisper, "Dignity is not what others give you. Dignity is what you refuse to give away." He had carried those words like a shield through boardrooms, negotiations, and now on his own aircraft, he carried them again. A part of him wanted to rise, to claim what was his, to confront the injustice head on. But another part, the part tempered by years of experience, knew the cost of confrontation was sometimes higher than the reward. People expected him to raise his voice, to become the stereotype they already carried in their minds. What they did not expect was silence. So he sat. He waited. The aircraft filled with the hum of boarding. Passengers found their seats, placed bags overhead, exchanged small talk. The cabin crew moved with rehearsed efficiency, though Rachel's hands trembled faintly when she secured a bin. She knew something was off. She just didn't want to face what. Daniel Brooks pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages, but his attention kept drifting back to Ethan. He couldn't help himself. He had never seen someone respond that way to humiliation, to blatant unfairness with such composure. He wanted to understand it. "You're just going to sit here and read," Daniel whispered again, his voice incredulous. Ethan glanced up, his expression calm. "What would you have me do? Call her out. Tell everyone it was your seat. Make her move back." Ethan's smile deepened slightly. "And what would that change?" She would resist. People would whisper. Some would believe her, not me. It would become a spectacle. And in the end, she would think she won by forcing me to raise my voice. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Slowly, he nodded, beginning to understand. "Patience," Ethan repeated softly, the word a mantra as he turned another page. The boarding announcements droned overhead. Bags thudded into compartments. A child cried somewhere in the back. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds of travel, something heavier pulsed through the cabin, invisible but undeniable. A shift had already begun. Rachel Moore passed Ethan again on her way to assist another passenger. Their eyes met briefly. She saw no anger in his gaze, no demand for explanation, only calm, steady patience. It unsettled her more than fury would have. She looked away quickly, ashamed without fully knowing why. Up in 2A, Victoria sipped her water with the air of a queen holding court. She believed she had silenced him, proven her place, reaffirmed the order she trusted. She could not see the quiet unraveling that was already in motion. Ethan settled deeper into his seat. The message he had sent earlier had already reached the right hands. He had no need to say another word. The truth was already on its way. As the cabin door closed and the crew prepared for final checks, Ethan allowed himself a single thought. Sharp and clear, patience is not silence. Patience is preparation. And when the time came, patience would prove louder than any voice raised in anger. Victoria Hale settled into 2A like a queen reclaiming her throne. She crossed her legs, placed her handbag neatly beside her, and leaned back into the leather seat with a smile so faint it was almost smug. To her, the issue had been settled neatly. A mistake corrected. Order restored. The champagne flute on her tray table sparkled under the cabin lights, reflecting her quiet sense of triumph. Rachel Moore moved about the cabin, trying to still the tremor in her hands. She collected boarding passes from stragglers, smiled at weary travelers, and handed out small bottles of water. Yet every step carried weight. The image of Ethan Cole rising from his seat replayed in her mind. The way he had looked at her, not with rage or even disappointment, but with patience, as though he already knew the truth would surface. That look unnerved her more than any outburst could have. Ethan himself sat in 5C, book open in his lap, his posture steady. To any casual observer, he looked like a man absorbed in quiet reading, but his thoughts moved quickly, precise as clockwork. The message he had sent earlier was already working its way through the channels. He did not need to raise his voice, because he understood something others did not. Real power did not shout. It moved silently, and when it revealed itself, the effect was absolute. Beside him, Daniel Brooks still buzzed with restless energy. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Ethan could hear. "She looks so proud of herself up there," Daniel muttered, glancing toward the front, "like she just conquered something." Ethan did not look up from his book. Pride built on injustice is fragile. It does not last. Daniel frowned. "I don't know how you can be so calm. If it were me, I'd be furious." Ethan turned a page slowly. Fury burns quickly. Patience endures. Daniel studied him, unsure whether to admire the composure or feel frustrated by it. But something about Ethan's presence drew him in. It was as though he was sitting next to a man who had already played this game 100 times and knew exactly how it would end. The last passengers boarded, filling the cabin with a chorus of zippers, chatter, and the scrape of overhead bins closing. The hum of the aircraft deepened as the engine stirred to life. A flight attendant announced final checks. Rachel walked briskly down the aisle, securing latches, smiling tightly at passengers. When she passed Ethan, she paused just briefly. Their eyes met again. No words passed between them, but the silence carried weight. She could feel her throat tighten, shame pressing at the back of her mind. She had acted without certainty, and now she knew it, but she kept walking. Victoria raised her glass of champagne and took a slow sip, savoring the taste and the moment. The leather seat embraced her. The sense of superiority wrapped itself around her shoulders like a silk shawl. She exhaled with quiet satisfaction. The man was gone. The seat was hers, and all was as it should be, or so she thought. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. Seatbelt signs illuminated. Passengers adjusted themselves, phones flickering off as the crew moved swiftly into their safety routines. But there was something different in the cabin now. A current of unease rippled beneath the surface, invisible yet undeniable. Some passengers had noticed the exchange earlier. Some had whispered to their seatmates, and already eyes were flicking discreetly between Victoria in 2A and Ethan in 5C. Daniel leaned back, shaking his head softly. "I swear, people are already talking." Ethan's lips curved into the faintest smile. The truth always finds ears. Meanwhile, in the galley, Rachel's name crackled over the intercom. Her heart jumped. "Rachel Moore, please report to the front immediately." She exchanged a quick glance with another crew member, then hurried forward, her pulse pounding. When she entered the galley, she froze. Standing there was Thomas Grant, the regional supervisor for Horizon Vista Airways. His suit was immaculate, his expression steel. "Step inside," Thomas said quietly. His voice was firm but restrained. the kind that left no room for argument. Rachel obeyed, the door clicking shut behind her. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Thomas asked. His tone clipped. Rachel's stomach twisted. "Sir, I thought there was a mistake with the seat assignment." Thomas pulled out his phone, swiping to the manifest. He turned the screen toward her. Seat 2A, Ethan Cole. The name glared back at her in black letters. "That man you displaced," Thomas said, lowering his voice to a deadly calm, "is Ethan Cole, the CEO, the owner of this airline. You just asked him to move because an entitled passenger whispered in your ear." Rachel's breath caught. I didn't know." "That's the problem." Thomas cut in sharply. "You didn't bother to confirm. You didn't double-check. You assumed. And you acted. Do you understand what that means?" Her throat felt dry. Words tangled in her mouth. "I swear I didn't mean you're done," Thomas said coldly. "Your employment with Horizon Vista is terminated effective immediately. Hand over your badge." Rachel's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. Her fingers trembled as she unclipped the badge from her uniform and placed it in his hand. "Please, Mr. Grant, it's over," Thomas said firmly. "This is not just about one mistake. This is about judgment, or the lack of it." Rachel's knees felt weak, but she stood frozen in place, staring at the floor. The muffled sounds of the cabin filtered through the galley walls. Passengers laughing, seat belts clicking, the ordinary rhythm of departure. But to Rachel, the world had just tilted off its axis. Thomas slipped the badge into his pocket. His jaw was tight, his voice clipped. "Stay here until we land. You will be escorted off." Rachel nodded numbly, tears threatening to fall. She realized in that moment that her career, the years she had built, had collapsed in the span of minutes, all because she had listened to the wrong voice. Back in the cabin, the murmurs were growing. Passengers sensed something had happened. A few had their phones angled slyly, recording snippets. The energy in the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Victoria noticed none of it. She raised her champagne glass again, savoring her victory. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind, a small seed of unease sprouted. The way Ethan had smiled, the way he had walked away without resistance, the calmness in his eyes. It unsettled her, though she refused to admit why. She pushed the thought aside. She was in 2A. He was in 5C. That was all that mattered. But Ethan Cole knew better. He turned another page in his book, his face composed, his posture steady. Inside, he could feel the moment building, like a storm gathering strength before the first crack of thunder. Patience was not surrender. It was preparation, and soon the truth would speak. The plane inched away from the gate, its engines humming louder as it prepared for taxi. Seatbelt signs blinked overhead, casting soft light across the first-class cabin. For a moment, everything appeared calm, the way every flight is meant to feel at its start. But beneath that calm, something restless stirred. Passengers exchanged glances, whispers barely audible over the background announcements. A businessman in 3C leaned closer to his wife, gesturing subtly toward 2A. She nodded with pursed lips, her eyes flicking toward Ethan Cole in 5C before quickly returning to her magazine. Another passenger scrolled on his phone, tapping out a message with hurried fingers, his eyes darting back toward Victoria Hale, who was sipping her champagne like a victor savoring the spoils of war. Victoria noticed the stares, though at first she interpreted them as admiration. To her, eyes naturally belonged on her. She lifted her glass higher, adjusted her posture, and pretended not to see the faint looks of disapproval that rippled through the cabin. In 5C, Ethan remained composed, book balanced lightly in his hand. His eyes traced the words, but his thoughts lingered elsewhere. He was acutely aware of the murmurs building around him, of the shifting energy in the room. It wasn't anger he felt rising within him, but a deep certainty. The truth was already in motion, and soon it would no longer belong to him alone. Beside him, Daniel Brooks fidgeted. The young man's eyes darted between Ethan, Victoria, and the other passengers. The murmurs felt louder to him, each whisper like a drumbeat. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They're talking about her," Daniel muttered. "People are already saying it's messed up. What she did, I think someone even recorded it." Ethan did not lift his gaze from the page. "Let them talk," he said softly. Daniel frowned. "You don't even care I care," Ethan corrected, his tone measured. "I just don't need to add fuel. The fire is already lit." Daniel shook his head, amazed. "Man, I don't think I've ever seen someone this calm after being disrespected like that." Ethan allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. Calmness unsettles people more than anger ever will. As if to prove his point, a low ripple of chuckles rose from 2 rows ahead. A young woman in 3B leaned toward her seatmate, whispering just loud enough for others to hear. She really thought she could just take his seat. Her seatmate smirked, eyes flicking toward Victoria, who stiffened at the words, though she kept her gaze fixed ahead. The laughter stung her pride. She shifted in her seat, smoothing her blouse unnecessarily, trying to drown the unease bubbling in her chest. She reminded herself she had done nothing wrong, or at least, nothing she couldn't justify. She had been given that seat, hadn't she? She had flown this route before, hadn't she yet, deep inside? She knew the truth was thinner than paper, and the looks from those around her cut sharper than any words spoken directly. Rachel Moore sat in the galley, her badge already surrendered, her uniform suddenly heavy on her shoulders. Every sound outside the small curtain felt magnified. She heard the whispers, the subtle rise of disapproval, and her stomach knotted. She wished she could go back, wished she could undo the decision made in haste. But regret, she realized, did not erase consequences. The thought of facing her colleagues, her family, or even herself in the mirror filled her with dread. Thomas Grant stood near the cockpit door, arms crossed, his eyes sharp. He said nothing yet, but his presence was a reminder that what had unfolded would not stay hidden. Rachel's shame, Victoria's arrogance, Ethan's patience soon. Every detail would surface. Victoria shifted again, setting down her champagne with more force than intended. She finally glanced toward 5C. Her eyes met Ethan's for a split second. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even watching her. He was simply reading, utterly at ease. That quiet composure cut into her pride more than open hostility ever could. Why doesn't he fight back, she thought. Why doesn't he argue? The question gnawed at her, because deep down she knew the answer. He didn't need to, and that truth made her uneasy. A soft gasp broke the air behind her. A teenager in row 6 leaned toward her friend, phone angled discreetly in hand. "It's already online," she whispered, excitement barely contained. Her friend's eyes widened as she read the glowing screen. The words spread like wildfire. A woman just took a black CEO's first-class seat and got him moved back. Entitlement at its finest. A blurry photo of Victoria's profile accompanied the post. The caption punctuated with hashtags that carried weight. You're Ethan Cole. Justice served. Dignity first. Within minutes, notifications lit up across phones in the cabin. Some passengers gasped softly. Others exchanged knowing glances. A businessman coughed into his fist to mask a laugh. The atmosphere had shifted entirely now. Victoria was no longer a silent winner, but the center of a story unraveling in real time. She sensed it too. Her throat tightened. Her fingers clutched at the fabric of her slacks. She turned her face toward the window, pretending indifference, but the burn of humiliation spread like fire beneath her skin. She had thought she'd won quietly, but now she realized she had lost publicly. Daniel tilted his phone toward Ethan, eyes wide. "Look at this. You're trending already." Ethan glanced at the screen, then back to his book. "I told you. Patience." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "You're not even going to say anything. Not even one post." Ethan's lips curved faintly. "Why would I? The truth speaks louder than I ever could." As the aircraft lifted off, the cabin tilted with the force of acceleration. Yet for Victoria Hale, it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were judgments, growing louder in her own mind with every passing second. The man she had tried to displace sat behind her, calm, unreadable, untouched by the chaos she had stirred. And she, sitting in 2A, felt smaller than she ever had in her life. Ethan Cole turned another page, his patience steady as stone. The reckoning had only just begun. The aircraft climbed steadily, city lights shrinking beneath the clouds until only darkness and stars surrounded the cabin. But inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. The hum of engines was steady, yet a low current of whispers carried from row to row, fueled by glowing phone screens and furtive glances. Victoria Hale shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass. She had tried to ignore the murmurs, but every flick of a passenger's eyes felt like a spotlight. Every faint chuckle struck her nerves like a hammer. She pressed the glass to her lips, swallowing quickly, though the taste had soured in her mouth. In 5C, Ethan Cole remained still, book in hand. To anyone watching, he looked absorbed in the lines of text. But beneath that calm exterior, he was listening. He could hear the whispers circling, the murmurs spreading, the quiet judgment taking shape. It was not triumph, he felt, but inevitability. The truth, once revealed, could not be buried again. Rachel Moore sat stiffly in the galley, staring down at her folded hands. The words of Thomas Grant still echoed in her ears. Terminated? Effective immediately? Her throat tightened each time she remembered the manifest. Ethan Cole's name printed in black and white. Proof she had ignored. Shame burned hot in her chest. Yet even now, she could not summon the courage to step back into the cabin, at the front of first class. A senior attendant named Susan Miller moved briskly down the aisle with a clipboard. Her posture was straight, her expression composed, but her eyes carried a quiet steel. She had been informed of the situation in a clipped whisper by Thomas before departure, and now it was her responsibility to correct the mistake publicly. She stopped at seat 2A. "Ms. Hale," she said softly, her voice polite but firm. Victoria turned, lifting her chin slightly as though bracing herself. "Yes." Susan glanced at the clipboard, then back at her. "I need to confirm your seat assignment." Victoria forced a light laugh, trying to mask the panic already stirring. "I was upgraded. This is my seat." Susan nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the page. "You are listed here as 14D? That's your original ticketed seat." The words fell like stones. Passengers nearby stilled, ears tilting toward the exchange. The whispers hushed. Victoria's face flushed, but she forced composure. "No, you don't understand. They gave me the seat. There must have been some error on the manifest." Susan's lips curved slightly, though not in amusement. "The manifest is correct. Ms. Hale. Seat 2A has always belonged to Mr. Ethan Cole." A ripple of recognition passed through the cabin. The name was already spreading online, but now it landed within the closed walls of the aircraft like thunder. All eyes shifted again, from Susan to Victoria, then down the aisle toward Ethan, who sat quietly turning a page. Victoria's stomach dropped. For a moment, she could barely breathe. "Well, I'm already here," she said finally, her voice tight, trembling despite her attempt at control. "So why cause a scene?" Susan's expression did not waver. "This isn't about causing a scene. This is about correcting one. Please gather your belongings and return to your assigned seat in economy." The word economy struck like a slap. Murmurs rose again, some passengers exchanging incredulous looks, others stifling smiles. A businessman near the aisle lowered his phone discreetly, already capturing the moment. "I'm not moving," Victoria said, her voice sharper now, eyes flashing. She gripped the armrest tightly, refusing to budge. "I paid for this upgrade. This is my seat." Susan's tone stayed even. Upgrades are conditional on availability. They cannot displace a ticketed passenger, especially not the rightful holder of this seat. Victoria's jaw clenched. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear over it. She turned her face away, pretending indifference, but the weight of dozens of stares pressed into her like a physical force. And then, from behind, a deeper voice joined the moment. Calm, controlled, impossible to ignore. "You don't really have a choice, Ms. Hale." Her body froze. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned her head. Ethan Cole's eyes met hers across the cabin. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't stood. He hadn't abandoned his book. Yet the weight of his words hung in the air heavier than any command. The silence that followed was deafening. Passengers waited, breath held, to see what she would do. Victoria's pride battled her fear, her face burning with humiliation. She wanted to argue, to fight, to hold her ground, but the authority in Ethan's gaze, the quiet strength behind it, left her with no defense. Slowly, trembling, she reached for her handbag. Susan extended a hand toward the aisle. "This way, Ms. Hale." The walk down the aisle was agony. Every step felt like a spotlight, every glance a judgment. Some passengers tried to hide their smirks behind hands. Others simply watched, eyes cold with silent verdict. When she reached the economy cabin, the contrast struck her like a blow. Narrower seats, less space, no champagne, no illusion of privilege. Susan gestured to the middle seat in 14D. Victoria lowered herself stiffly between two strangers, her face burning. The man in 14 gave her a brief glance before turning away, uninterested. The woman in 14C barely acknowledged her at all. Here, she was no queen. She was nobody. Back in first class. A ripple of release passed through the passengers. Some smiled. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Daniel Brooks leaned closer to Ethan, unable to contain his grin. "That was incredible," Daniel whispered. Ethan glanced at him, calm as ever. "It was inevitable." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You didn't even have to do anything." She buried herself. Ethan turned another page in his book. the faintest smile at the corner of his lips. Truth doesn't need help. It only needs time. Behind the curtain, Victoria sat rigid in 14D, her heart pounding, humiliation coursing through her veins. She could feel the quiet laughter, the sidelong glances, the judgment heavy as iron, and worse still, she knew it was only beginning. The cabin door sealed, the pressurized hush filling the aircraft as it leveled off at cruising altitude. Meal carts clinked in the galley, screens flickered awake with in-flight maps, and a faint smell of reheated dinners drifted through the air. It was the rhythm of any long flight except for one woman whose every heartbeat felt like a spotlight. Victoria Hale sat wedged into 14D, shoulders stiff, hands clenched in her lap. The fabric of the economy seat pressed into her sides, a far cry from the leather embrace of first class. She stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of her. But she could feel it, the eyes on her, the whispers like waves rolling from row to row. 2 seats over, a teenage girl in 16A angled her phone just so, snapping a photo. The faint shutter sound made Victoria's stomach lurch. She turned her head sharply, but the girl only smirked, whispering to her friend in 16B, fingers flying across her screen. "Smile," the girl murmured, not even pretending to hide the mockery. Victoria's pulse quickened. She gripped the armrests, nails digging into the cheap fabric. Ignore them, she told herself. Ignore them, and this will pass. But the quiet giggles, the sideways glances, the not-so-subtle remarks, they swirled around her, each one slicing deeper than the last. 2 rows ahead, a woman leaned close to her husband, her voice deliberately audible. She really thought she could just take his seat. "Can you imagine?" Her husband chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Now look at her." Victoria's face burned hotter. The shame felt suffocating, pressing into her chest, clawing at her throat. She forced her lips into a thin line, determined not to cry, not to give them more satisfaction. But she knew it was useless. She was no longer in control of the story, if she ever had been. Back in first class. Ethan Cole turned another page of his book. His calm presence radiated like an anchor, steady and immovable amid the storm swirling just rows behind him. Daniel Brooks leaned closer, unable to resist glancing back toward economy. "They're eating her alive back there," Daniel whispered, eyes wide. Phones out, people whispering. "It's brutal." Ethan didn't look up. Humiliation is loud when dignity has been forfeited. Daniel shook his head in awe. "I've never seen anything like this." She thought she won for, what, 5 minutes, and now... His voice trailed off. Ethan's lips curved faintly. Truth has its own timetable. In economy. Victoria's phone buzzed to life as the aircraft's Wi-Fi signal connected. Against her better judgment, she unlocked it. The first notification nearly made her drop the device. "Your name is all over Twitter. What did you do?" Another came seconds later. "Call me ASAP. It's everywhere." Her breath caught. She opened her browser, her hands trembling. There it was, her face, captured from half a dozen angles, headlines, captions, hashtags. A woman just tried to steal a black CEO's first-class seat and got moved back to economy. Privilege on full display. Why, Ethan Cole. Was justice served? Her walk of shame is legendary. Images of her stiff posture in 14D flooded the feed, some with mocking text scrawled over them. How it started, how it's going. Others compared her smug champagne toast in 2A with her current expression, wilted and trapped between 2 strangers. Her vision blurred, her pulse hammered in her ears. She tried to scroll faster, desperate to find a defense, an explanation, but the internet had already judged her. And once it decided, there was no undoing it. She shoved the phone back into her purse, her chest tight. The murmurs around her only grew louder. A man across the aisle glanced at her, shook his head, and muttered to his seatmate, "Wild how people act when they think no one's watching." Victoria swallowed hard. She wanted to shout, to explain, to tell them they didn't know the whole story. But the truth pressed against her ribs. She had created this story herself. Rachel Moore sat silently in the crew jump seat near the galley, hands trembling in her lap. She hadn't seen the online explosion yet, but she didn't need to. She could feel the weight of her mistake in the air. The humiliation Victoria endured now was a mirror of her own, waiting to unfold once the flight landed. She thought of the years she had given to aviation, the career she had built, the pride she once felt in her uniform. All of it unraveled in a single choice. Up front, Susan Miller walked the aisle with practiced ease, checking on passengers. When she passed 14D, her eyes flicked briefly toward Victoria, then away again. No sympathy showed on her face, only a professional neutrality. The correction had been made. The rest was out of her hands. For Victoria, that neutrality cut deeper than scorn. She longed for someone, anyone, to side with her, to whisper that it wasn't her fault. But no one did. She was alone, utterly and completely. Daniel nudged Ethan again. "Look, Mr. Cole, someone already posted a side-by-side meme. It's everywhere. You're trending #1. Ethan lifted his gaze just long enough to glance at the phone screen. His expression didn't change. He looked back at his book, calm as ever. "I don't need to say a word," Ethan murmured. "The world will do the talking." Daniel leaned back, shaking his head. "Man, you're on another level." Ethan's calmness was not for show. Inside, he felt a quiet ache. Not for himself, he had faced worse, and he knew who he was, but for the endless repetition of this pattern, for the way prejudice disguised as assumption still clawed its way into ordinary moments. He did not seek revenge. He sought change, and sometimes change required letting truth unfold where all could see it. In 14D, Victoria sat frozen. Each ping of a nearby phone felt like a dagger. Each muffled laugh landed like a blow. She had thought she was untouchable, and now she realized she was not just touchable, she was disposable, reduced to a meme in less than an hour. Her throat tightened. For the first time, she questioned herself deeply. Was it really just about a seat, or had it been about who she believed belonged in that seat? The thought gnawed at her, relentless, but she shoved it away, burying it beneath layers of denial. She could not face it. Not yet. The aircraft continued westward, steady and unbothered, while inside, a woman's life unraveled one whisper, one photo, one notification at a time, and in the quiet strength of 5C, Ethan Cole turned another page, patience steady, eyes calm, as the reckoning deepened with every passing mile. The cabin lights dimmed to a gentle glow as the flight attendants prepared for the meal service. Most passengers settled into movies or cracked open books, but the atmosphere never softened. It hummed with a different energy, one that Victoria Hale felt in her bones. She sat in 14D, rigid, hands folded too neatly in her lap, as though if she held herself still enough, the whispers and the judgment would pass her by. But it didn't. Phones lit up across the rows. Glances darted her way, then quickly back to glowing screens. It was subtle at first, soft giggles, muffled exclamations, But then a man 2 seats ahead leaned to his wife and whispered, "She's all over the internet already." His wife gasped, covering her mouth as she scrolled. Victoria clenched her jaw, against every instinct screaming at her not to. She pulled her phone from her purse and switched it back on. The screen came alive with a flood of notifications. Her name, her photo, headlines she hadn't authorized, stories she hadn't told. A woman thought she could steal a black CEO's first-class seat. It didn't end well. This is Victoria Hale, the face of arrogance at 30,000 feet. Ethan Cole proves grace under pressure. While entitlement crumbles, Victoria's throat tightened. Her vision blurred as she scrolled, each post crueler than the last. Memes mocked her, side-by-side comparisons of her smug champagne toast in 2A against the stiff, cornered posture of her now in 14D. Comments piled high with jeers, privilege exposed. She thought she belonged. Now look at her. This is why bias training matters. She fumbled to type a response, anything to defend herself. But her fingers hovered, paralyzed. What could she say that she hadn't known who he was, that she just assumed? Even the excuses in her head sounded hollow. She deleted the half-formed words and shoved the phone back down, heart pounding. The sound of a soft chuckle made her head snap sideways. A teenage boy across the aisle, phone in hand, shook his head slowly. "Man, she's everywhere," he muttered to his friend. Their laughter, light and careless, seared her pride. Meanwhile, at the front of the aircraft, Ethan Cole remained the picture of composure. The book in his hands turned page by page, his posture unshaken, his breathing steady. To him, the storm swirling around Victoria was not entertainment, but evidence. Evidence of how arrogance collapses under its own weight, and how dignity quiet, steady, unforced holds stronger than any defense. Daniel Brooks, still seated beside him, leaned in, his phone tilted toward Ethan. "Mr. Cole, look, you're trending #1 across 3 platforms. Twitter, Instagram, even Reddit. People are calling it a masterclass in patience." Ethan lifted his gaze briefly to the glowing screen, then back to his book. Patience reveals more than outrage ever could. Daniel shook his head. "You don't even need to tweet. The world's doing the work for you." A faint smile touched Ethan's lips. "The truth doesn't need me to amplify it. It carries its own weight." He returned to his reading, but his thoughts stretched further than the page. He thought of his father's words years ago, when he was a boy struggling with the sting of being underestimated. "Son, sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is strength waiting to be recognized." Tonight, those words echoed more clearly than ever. Rachel Moore sat hidden in the galley, the sound of laughter and murmurs cutting her deeper with each passing moment. She knew her career had ended the moment Thomas Grant confronted her. But hearing the passengers, feeling the ridicule spreading through the cabin, it carved into her with brutal precision. She thought of her choices, the small moment when she had leaned toward Ethan and told him to move. It had seemed harmless, routine, even protective, but in reality, it revealed something inside her. She wasn't proud of the ease of assuming, the blindness of bias. She pressed her palms together, wishing she could turn back time, wishing silence could erase her choice. But she knew the truth. Silence only amplifies guilt when justice is already unfolding. Back in 14D, Victoria adjusted her posture again, but no movement could shake the humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. A new notification pinged from her phone. Against her better judgment, she opened it. It was a news headline. Atlantic Airways confirms internal review after viral seat incident. Below it, the company's official statement read, "We do not tolerate discrimination or disrespect of passengers in any form. We commend Mr. Cole for his calm professionalism during the incident, and we are reviewing policies to ensure fairness for all." Her stomach lurched. Not only was she a viral spectacle, but the airline itself had drawn a line in the sand, and it wasn't in her favor. She snapped the phone shut, her chest tight. Rage and shame battled inside her. She wanted to shout at the passengers, tell them they didn't understand, that she wasn't a villain. But another, quieter voice gnawed at her. What if they were right? Her heart pounded louder. She thought of her friends, her colleagues, her family. Would they see these posts? Would they join the chorus of ridicule? The fear was suffocating. Back in first class, Susan Miller passed by with her clipboard, calm and professional. She stopped briefly near Ethan. "Mr. Cole, would you like dinner service first?" she asked softly. Ethan looked up, his expression kind but measured. "Whenever it's convenient for you," he replied. His tone carried no arrogance, no demand, only the quiet dignity that had defined him since the moment the conflict began. Susan nodded respectfully and continued. Daniel exhaled slowly. "You know, I don't think she realizes yet. This isn't just about tonight. This is going to follow her." Ethan's gaze drifted briefly toward the back of the cabin, though his book still rested in his lap. "Actions follow us longer than intentions," he said quietly. "That's the lesson she'll face long after this flight ends." Victoria sank further into her seat, eyes shut, wishing the hours ahead could vanish into nothing. But every vibration of her phone, every hushed laugh around her, reminded her of a truth she could not escape. The world had already judged her, and the verdict was merciless. The plane sailed forward through the night, steady and unbothered. Inside, one man's quiet strength contrasted with another woman's unraveling shame. And though Ethan Cole had not raised his voice once, his silence spoke louder than any condemnation could. The flight had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Passengers shifted under thin blankets. Screens flickered with quiet movies, and the cabin lights glowed a muted amber. But for Victoria Hale, there was no rest. She sat stiff in 14D, her pulse racing as though she were standing under a spotlight on a stage she'd never wanted. Every vibration of her phone was a new dagger. Against her better judgment, she unlocked it again. The first thing she saw was her own face frozen in that humiliating moment when she was led from seat 2A back to economy. The caption above it read, "Privilege denied at 35,000 feet." Thousands of comments spilled beneath it, a cascade of ridicule, moral outrage, and bitter amusement. Her fingers scrolled faster. News outlets had already picked it up. Passenger tries to claim. CEO's seat gets publicly corrected. Others were more brutal. The walk of shame. Heard around the world. Her throat closed. She wanted to scream, to argue, to correct the narrative, but the words clung like ash in her chest. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't sound like excuse, and even if she tried, the mob had already made up its mind. In first class. Ethan Cole turned another page in his book. He felt the hum of energy around him, phones buzzing, whispers echoing through the cabin, but his focus never wavered. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the chaos brewing only a few rows behind him. Daniel Brooks shifted beside him, shaking his head in disbelief. "Mr. Cole, look at this. CNN just posted about it. You're everywhere." Ethan's eyes lifted briefly, glancing at the glowing phone. A headline scrolled across the screen. Atlantic Airways CEO shows grace under pressure during viral seat incident. Daniel grinned. You didn't even say a word. And people are calling it leadership. That's power. Ethan closed his book for a moment, resting his hands on the cover. Power isn't in the volume of your voice. It's in the steadiness of your character. Daniel studied him, the admiration clear in his eyes. Still, you could crush her if you wanted. Just one statement, and she's finished forever. Ethan shook his head. Justice doesn't require cruelty. The truth is enough. Back in the galley, Rachel Moore sat silently, her uniform still on, but feeling like a costume she no longer deserved to wear. Her hands trembled in her lap, shame heavy in her chest. She had built a career in service, telling herself she cared for people equally. But tonight, one assumption had stripped it all away. She thought of her training, the lines repeated about fairness and dignity, yet when confronted with a choice between instinct and protocol, she had chosen instinct, and instinct had betrayed her. She wanted to apologize, to walk down the aisle and say the words aloud. But fear rooted her in place. She knew nothing could erase what she had done. Meanwhile, Susan Miller walked through the aisles with her professional calm. She carried a quiet authority, ensuring passengers felt safe, even as murmurs rose and fell around her. When she passed by Victoria, her expression didn't change. Professional neutrality, that was all Victoria received. That neutrality stung worse than open judgment. Victoria's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from her boss. We need to talk. First thing in the morning. Her chest tightened. She already knew what it meant. Her reputation wasn't just unraveling in the cabin. It was bleeding into her career, her future, her life outside this flight. She shoved the phone back into her purse and closed her eyes. But the darkness behind her eyelids wasn't relief. It was worse. She saw her colleagues whispering. She saw her friends shaking their heads. She saw her name trending, not as a respected professional, but as a meme, a warning, a symbol of arrogance. The thought clawed at her. Had it all started with one assumption, one look at him, one whisper in a flight attendant's ear, and now everything she'd built was burning. Her stomach churned. She pressed her lips together, refusing to let the tears fall. She couldn't. Not here. Not with everyone watching. In 5C, Ethan leaned back slightly, eyes drifting from his book to the quiet window. The clouds outside glowed faintly under the moonlight, endless and still. He thought of his journey, of the countless times he had faced moments like this, subtle and overt, each one demanding he choose between anger and patience. His father's words returned again. Dignity doesn't beg, it simply stands, and in standing, it teaches. He hadn't wanted this incident, hadn't sought it, but perhaps it could become more than humiliation for one woman. Perhaps it could become a mirror, forcing others to confront truths they preferred to ignore. Daniel broke his silence. Mr. Cole, do you ever get tired of always having to be the bigger person? Ethan's eyes lingered on the window for a moment longer before he turned back. Of course. But tiredness doesn't absolve us of responsibility. If we don't carry dignity into these spaces, who will? Daniel nodded slowly, his admiration deepening. You make it look easy. A faint smile crossed Ethan's lips. It's not easy. It's necessary. In 14D. Victoria shifted, unable to find comfort in the narrow seat. A man across the aisle glanced at her and muttered, She deserves it, not even bothering to lower his voice. The words stung. piercing through her fragile composure. She wanted to shout, to tell him he didn't know her, that she wasn't the monster the internet painted. But the truth lingered like a shadow. She had made herself the villain, even if she hadn't meant to. Another notification lit up her phone. This time, it was from a friend. "I can't believe it's you. Why would you do that?" Her heart cracked. Even those closest to her were slipping away. She was no longer just a stranger on a plane. She was a headline, a meme, a cautionary tale. The plane flew steady through the night, but inside, lives were shifting. One woman's arrogance was unraveling into humiliation and consequence. One man's patience was becoming a beacon of strength for millions watching beyond the cabin walls. And as the hours ticked by, Victoria Hale realized the world she would land in was no longer the one she had left behind. The hours bled together as the aircraft glided westward. Outside, the night was endless, stars scattered across a velvet sky, while inside, the cabin vibrated with a strange tension. Passengers shifted in their seats, not from turbulence, but from the quiet thrill of witnessing something bigger than a single flight. Everyone knew they were part of a story now. Victoria Hale sat in 14D, stiff as stone, her body aching from holding itself so tightly. Her phone buzzed endlessly, but she could no longer bring herself to look. The last headline she had seen was enough to paralyze her. The walk of shame at 30,000 feet. Victoria Hale becomes symbol of entitlement. Every whisper, every sideways glance around her confirmed what she already feared. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the subject of ridicule, a living spectacle trapped in a narrow seat with nowhere to hide. The teenager in 16A giggled again, her phone angled discreetly toward Victoria. Another photo, another post. Victoria clenched her fists, the heat rising to her face. She wanted to snatch the phone away, to demand privacy. But deep down she knew she had forfeited her right to dignity when she decided she could take someone else's seat. 2 rows up, a businessman leaned toward his seatmate. "They're already calling it Seat 2A syndrome," he whispered with a smirk. "You try to take what isn't yours, and you end up a meme." Victoria shut her eyes, but the words lodged in her ears like barbed wire. In first class. Ethan Cole sat calmly in 5C, his posture unshaken, his focus steady on the book in his hands. Daniel Brooks glanced back at the commotion and economy before turning to Ethan. "Mr. Cole." "I don't get it," Daniel said quietly. "You could have shut this down right away. You could have called her out yourself, pulled rank, told everyone who you are. Why didn't you?" Ethan lowered his book and looked at Daniel with quiet intensity. "Because sometimes the lesson is stronger when it teaches itself. If I had shouted, it would have been a conflict. By stepping back, it became a mirror. People saw the truth without me forcing it." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the words. "Still, she looks destroyed back there." Ethan's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "Destruction is what happens when arrogance meets accountability. My hope is that she learns. That's the only way humiliation has meaning." Rachel Moore sat silent in the galley, her hands trembling in her lap. The weight of what she had done pressed heavier with each passing hour. She thought of her family, of the career she had built, of the way she once wore her uniform with pride. Now all of it felt like ash. Every time a passenger laughed at Victoria, Rachel felt a pang of recognition. They weren't just mocking Victoria, they were mocking her choice too. She had been complicit. She had enforced the lie. And when Thomas Grant's voice had cut through her excuses, she had known instantly her career was over. She stared at the metal floor beneath her shoes and whispered to herself, "Why didn't I just check? Why didn't I just trust the manifest instead of an assumption?" But no answer came. Only silence and the distant murmur of passengers feeding off the viral storm. Hours later, the captain's voice finally crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our initial descent into Los Angeles in approximately 30 minutes. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure your belongings are secure." A ripple of anticipation moved through the cabin. For most passengers, descent meant arrival, a return to normal life. But for Victoria Hale, it felt like the edge of a cliff. Her heart thudded as she imagined stepping into the terminal. Would there be cameras? Would reporters be waiting? Would strangers recognize her face? Whispering, pointing. She gripped the armrests until her knuckles whitened. She thought of her colleagues, how many had already seen the headlines, the memes, the humiliation. She imagined walking into her office tomorrow, faces turning, whispers spreading like wildfire. But then another fear twisted in her chest. Perhaps she wouldn't even have an office to return to. Her boss's message echoed like a drumbeat. "We need to talk." Her throat tightened. She wanted to cry, but no tears came, only dread. The descent grew bumpier, light turbulence rocking the cabin. Passengers clutched armrests or braced drinks. But the unease in the air wasn't about the movement of the plane. It was about the weight of what everyone knew was waiting on the ground. In 5C, Ethan closed his book and slipped it into his briefcase. He fastened his belt and leaned back, eyes calm, posture steady. Daniel looked at him in quiet awe. "You really don't seem worried at all," Daniel said. "There's nothing to worry about." Ethan replied, "The truth has already done its work." Daniel hesitated. "Do you think she'll ever recover?" Ethan's gaze flicked briefly toward the back of the cabin. "Recovery is a choice. She can run from it or face it. What she does now will decide the rest of her life." The words carried the weight of lived experience, of years navigating spaces where dignity was tested, where patience was demanded. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't revel in her downfall. He only acknowledged it as the inevitable consequence of choices made. Victoria's pulse hammered harder as the seatbelt sign illuminated. Her palms were damp, her body tense. She pictured herself walking off the plane, the eyes following her, the whispers trailing. She imagined the first phone call she would have to answer, the first explanation she would have to attempt. But every scenario ended the same, with judgment, with loss, with shame. The landing gear thudded into place, the plane shuddering slightly as it descended toward the city of lights sprawling beneath them. Los Angeles glittered in the darkness, indifferent to the private catastrophe unfolding inside its incoming flight. Passengers straightened in their seats, stowed belongings, adjusted headphones. The routine of landing carried on, masking the extraordinary undercurrent of this particular descent. Victoria stared out the window, her reflection pale against the city lights. She whispered to herself, "Maybe it will die down. Maybe tomorrow it will all be gone." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. The internet never forgets. And tonight, the internet had branded her forever. The wheels screeched against the runway, jolting the cabin as the aircraft slowed. Engines roaring. Applause scattered faintly among passengers, a ritual of relief. But for Victoria, the landing brought no relief, only the terrifying certainty that reality was about to meet her head-on. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Ethan folded his hands calmly in his lap. His breathing was steady, his gaze focused. Daniel leaned close, whispering, Mr. Cole, the second those doors open, everything changes, doesn't it? Ethan nodded slightly. Yes, for her, especially. But change isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's the beginning of a reckoning. The plane rolled to a stop. The seatbelt sign chimed, and passengers stirred with the impatience of disembarkation. Bags were pulled from overhead bins, jackets shrugged on, phones checked again. The normal chaos of landing resumed, but beneath it, everyone knew the story wasn't ending at the gate. It was only beginning. Victoria's hands trembled as she unbuckled her belt. The walk she was about to take, the aisle, the terminal, the cameras, the eyes. It would be the longest walk of her life. And Ethan Cole, silent and composed, prepared himself not with anger or triumph, but with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through from the very start. The moment the seatbelt sign went off, the cabin erupted with the usual shuffle of impatience. Overhead bins opened, bags tumbled down, jackets were pulled tight, and the smell of recycled air mingled with perfume and coffee. To most passengers, it was a normal landing, the final steps before returning to their lives. But for Victoria Hale, the moment felt like a guillotine descending. She sat frozen in 14D, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the buckle. The seatbelt clattered open, but her legs refused to move. Around her, passengers shifted into the aisle, their faces illuminated by the glow of phones. Whispers passed between them like sparks. Some hid their smirks. Others didn't bother. Is that her, one man murmured? Yeah, the one from the posts. Another replied, Unbelievable. Victoria's throat constricted. She knew she couldn't hide. The narrow aisle was a stage, and every step she took would be scrutinized. Up ahead in first class, Ethan Cole rose smoothly from his seat. He retrieved his briefcase, slid his book inside, and buttoned his jacket with unhurried grace. Daniel Brooks stood beside him, eyes flicking nervously between Ethan and the crowd. Mr. Cole, Daniel whispered, they're waiting for you too. Look. Through the small gap at the front door, the terminal beyond glowed with harsh fluorescent light. Silhouettes gathered people with cameras, reporters clutching microphones, curious travelers craning their necks. The story had left the cabin and spread like wildfire into the terminal. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks, his expression composed. Let them wait. The chime sounded. The door opened, and the line of passengers began to shuffle forward. Victoria's chest tightened as the rows emptied one by one, bringing her closer to the inevitable. She clutched her handbag so tightly her knuckles whitened, the leather biting into her skin. When her row finally moved, she stood on unsteady legs. The aisle felt narrower than it ever had before. She stepped forward, each footfall heavy, her body rigid. Passengers leaned aside but didn't look away. Phones angled subtly, or not so subtly captured her every move. She heard the click of cameras, the faint chime of recording apps, the low hiss of someone whispering. That's her, right there. Her face burned. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into nothing before she reached the door. But the walk stretched endlessly. At the front, Ethan waited his turn, unbothered by the chaos. Susan Miller, clipboard in hand, glanced at him with a quiet nod of respect. Daniel hovered close, almost protective, though Ethan needed no protection. His calm was armor enough. When Victoria reached first class, her eyes darted desperately, hoping for some reprieve. Instead, she found Ethan's gaze. He didn't glare. He didn't smirk. His eyes were steady, cool, unshaken, a mirror she couldn't escape. She lowered her head, unable to hold the weight of his silence, and hurried past him toward the door. The terminal hit her like a wave. Dozens of people stood waiting, phones raised high, flashes erupting. A reporter shouted, "Victoria, do you have any comment?" Another, "Why did you think you could take his seat?" She froze, panic clawing at her chest. The crowd pressed closer, and the questions cut sharper. Her instinct was to run, but the cameras captured every twitch of her face, every tremor in her hands. She pushed forward, weaving through the sea of onlookers. The whispers followed, entitled, "Arrogant, Caught." By the time she reached baggage claim, her legs felt hollow, her breath ragged. 2 teenagers pointed at her, laughing, one holding up a phone screen with her meme plastered across it. Her stomach turned. Meanwhile, Rachel Moore sat in a fluorescent-lit office tucked away in the employee wing. Her uniform was still crisp, but her badge was gone. Across the table, an HR representative folded her hands neatly, her expression impassive. "Ms. Moore," the woman said, "your employment with Atlantic Airways is officially terminated effective immediately." This incident has prompted a wider review of our passenger treatment policies. Rachel swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "I know I made a mistake, but I didn't know who he was." The HR woman's eyes hardened. "That's exactly the problem. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them fairly." The word struck deeper than any headline, sharper than any whisper. Rachel's shoulders slumped. She unclipped the last of her uniform accessories, laying them gently on the table as though surrendering pieces of herself. When she left the office, the corridor felt endless, the walls closing in. She had always believed flying was her life, her purpose. Now, she wasn't sure what was left. Back in the terminal, Ethan emerged at last. The air seemed to shift as he stepped through the doorway, his quiet authority radiating even in silence. Cameras swiveled instantly toward him. Reporters surged forward. "Mr. Cole, do you want to make a statement?" One shouted. "Mr. Cole, how do you respond to the viral videos?" Another pressed. "Are you planning legal action?" Ethan paused, adjusting the strap of his briefcase. He looked out at the sea of flashing lights, microphones, and curious eyes. Then, with the faintest of smiles, he shook his head. No statement. He said simply, his voice calm but resolute. And with that, he walked forward, the crowd parting instinctively. His silence spoke louder than any prepared line could have. It wasn't avoidance, it was power. He didn't need to defend himself. The world had already seen the truth. Daniel trailed behind, wide-eyed at the spectacle. "Sir, they'll spin this any way they want. Are you sure you don't want to clarify?" Ethan's steps never faltered. "They don't need my words. They have the story already. Dignity doesn't explain itself. It simply exists." The black SUV waited outside, sleek and polished under the terminal lights. The driver opened the door with a respectful nod. Ethan slid inside without hesitation. The chaos left behind as the vehicle pulled away into the night. Victoria, meanwhile, stood frozen near the carousel, her suitcase tumbling past on the conveyor belt. She couldn't bring herself to reach for it, not while dozens of eyes still lingered. She felt hollow, stripped of everything she had wrapped around her identity status, confidence, superiority. Now, she was only a symbol, and not the kind she could live with. Rachel, walking alone out a side exit, clutched her bag against her chest. She had lost her career, but worse, she had lost the illusion she had once believed in, that she was fair, that she was above bias. She knew now she wasn't, and she would have to carry that knowledge into whatever came next. The stories of these two women had collided in one cabin, but their consequences were only beginning. And through it all, Ethan Cole remained the same calm, steady, unshaken. A man who didn't need to fight for dignity because his presence demanded it. 2 weeks later, Los Angeles had already moved on to its usual chaos traffic crawling along freeways, endless meetings filling skyscrapers, and headlines shifting to the next scandal. But for Victoria Hale, time had stopped. She sat in her darkened apartment, blinds drawn, a half-empty glass of wine sweating on the table beside her. Her phone lay face down, vibrating occasionally with notifications she refused to check. The first few days after the flight, she had tried to fight. She had posted statements insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that she hadn't meant anything by it, that she was being unfairly vilified. But the internet was merciless. Screenshots of her words were mocked, dissected, and memed until she gave up. Now, silence was her only companion. Her job had let her go. The official line was a misalignment with company values, but she knew the truth. No one wanted to be associated with the woman who had become a living symbol of entitlement. Friends stopped returning her calls. Even her closest confidants sent polite but distant messages. Maybe it's best to lay low for a while. She thought of that walk down the plane's aisle every night before bed. The stares, the whispers, the clicks of cameras. It replayed in her mind like a cruel loop. She wondered if she would ever be able to board another flight without feeling those eyes on her. And the cruelest truth of all was the one she couldn't escape. She had done this to herself. Across the city. Rachel Moore sat hunched over her laptop, rejection emails flashing across the screen. Every airline she applied to sent the same sterile message. Thank you for your interest, but we have decided to move forward with other candidates. The aviation industry was smaller than she had ever realized. Word traveled fast, and being fired directly by a CEO meant her name was toxic. Even regional carriers didn't want the risk. She closed her laptop with a sharp snap and pressed her palms against her face. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She thought about reaching out to Ethan Cole, to beg for forgiveness, to ask for another chance. But what would she even say? I didn't know who you were. The words rang hollow, even in her imagination. Because that was the lesson she couldn't escape. It shouldn't have mattered who he was. She whispered to herself in the quiet, I ruined everything. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole sat in his executive office, sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Los Angeles. His assistant placed a folder on his desk. The final report on the incident. Mr. Cole, she said, her tone crisp. The fallout has been overwhelming. Public reaction is strongly in your favor. Atlantic Airways stock is up 4%. People are calling the way you handled it a masterclass in grace under pressure. Ethan lifted the folder, but didn't open it. Summarize it for me. Rachel Moore has been permanently terminated. Victoria Hale has been unofficially blacklisted from several companies. Her employer cited public controversy as the reason for dismissal. Media outlets continue to praise your response, or rather, your lack of one. People admire that you never once raised your voice or made a public statement. A faint smile curved Ethan's lips. A master class. Huh. His assistant returned the smile. It's what they're saying. Ethan leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the skyline. He had never wanted revenge. He hadn't needed to humiliate anyone. The world had done that for him. All he had done was remain steady, unshaken, unwilling to let arrogance strip him of his dignity. His father's words came back again. Dignity doesn't shout. It simply stands, and in standing, it teaches. He sipped his coffee, the warmth grounding him. Outside, the city hummed with its endless pace, but inside his office, there was peace. Later that evening, he returned to his penthouse, the city lights twinkling far below. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stepped out onto the balcony. The night air was cool against his skin. His phone buzzed, a message from his communications officer, trending at #1 again. "Do you want to release a statement?" Ethan stared at the words for a moment, then typed back, "No. Let them talk." He set the phone down and leaned against the railing, watching the headlights weave through the streets below. Justice had already been served, not through anger, not through noise, but through patience. Somewhere in another part of the city, Victoria scrolled endlessly through her phone, the glow illuminating her hollow face. Each headline was another reminder of who she had become. Entitled passenger, seat 2-0 villain, privilege personified. And Rachel, sitting alone at her kitchen table, wondered what she would do tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, now that the life she had built was gone. The echoes of that one flight had rippled outward, reshaping 3 lives in different ways. For Victoria, it was downfall. For Rachel, reckoning. For Ethan, affirmation. The world, too, had taken notice. News programs debated the incident. Corporations used it as a training example. And social media adopted it as a symbol dignity under pressure, arrogance undone, justice without a raised voice. Ethan Cole closed his eyes, inhaling the night air deeply. For the first time in a long time, he felt nothing but peace, because in the end, the truth had spoken louder than he ever needed to, and the world had listened. Ethan Cole never raised his voice. He never lashed out, never demanded attention. And yet, the world saw everything. The arrogance of entitlement, the blindness of bias, the weight of silence. What began as a stolen seat became something much larger, a mirror held up to society. Victoria Hale lost more than a seat in first class. She lost the illusion that privilege could shield her from accountability. Rachel Moore lost her job, but also discovered the truth about her own choices and the hidden biases she had ignored for years. And Ethan, he reminded us all of something simple, but profound, that dignity cannot be taken away unless we hand it over. His patience turned humiliation into justice, and his silence became a lesson louder than any speech. This story is not just about a single flight. It's about all of us, how we treat one another, how we confront prejudice, and how we choose to stand, even when the world tries to move us. If this story moved you, let it be more than just a story. Carry its message forward. And don't forget like, share, and subscribe so you can join us for the next story that will challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after the final word.